This little book that I chose to talk about this month has become so much richer than I expected it to be when I first read it. This is the book called The Four Agreements, a Toltec wisdom book by Don Miguel Ruiz. He is a former surgeon who had a near-death experience, and it really woke him up. And he went back into his roots, his Toltec wisdom roots, and began to do his spiritual work and came up with these teachings. It's so simple. It is such a simple book. And yet, when one is planning to speak about it for 20 minutes on a Sunday, one gets involved. And boy, have I found stuff. We could spend this is a lifetime of practice. I could break down just this topic into 3 talks. So I'll come back to it as time goes on. The Toltec wisdom is ancient wisdom, and yet it's brand new and fresh because it speaks to the human condition. And Miguel Ruiz said that back 3,000 years ago, people weren't ready to hear it. And now we are, and I wonder if we are. Many of us are, and maybe many were 3,000 years ago. The point is, it's always pertinent because it's always just incredible lessons for us all. So these are the 4 agreements. Last week we talked about be impeccable with your word, and today, don't take things personally. Next week, don't make assumptions. And the final week, always do your best. They seem so simple, and they're very, very challenging at the same time. Be impeccable with your words, what we talked about last week. And these are some of the points that Miguel Ruiz talks about. Speaking with integrity, say only what you mean. Avoid using the word to speak against yourself or to gossip about others. And the bottom line, use the power of your word in the direction of truth and love. Many of you enjoyed that little think slide that I had up last week. Before you speak, think, and take the THINK. Is it true? Is it helpful? I was going to say honest. No. Is it helpful? Is it, help me, inspiring? Is it necessary? And is it kind? Well, that's still just touching the surface. As I read and prepared, don't take it personally, I started to get about this one. So keep this in mind. This is very challenging for us, and yet it'll make more sense as we look at the others. So today, don't take anything personally. The point is, we have been taught to act. We have been domesticated, Miguel says. We learned from early childhood what was acceptable and what was not, based on the book of rules of our parents and teachers, ministers, rabbis. So we learned what was acceptable, and we chose to act that way because we wanted their approval. We wanted to be accepted. And so basically, that's fear-based behavior. Don't do this because you might get punished. Do this so that you'll get approval. And that's certainly a fear-based way of thinking. And so Miguel says, if we can wake up to the idea that we've been taught to act in certain ways in order to make sure we maintain that approval from the people who are important to us, then we can just stay on an even keel. We could just keep acting, follow the book of rules. And what we learned eventually was we incorporated those rules into our own heads so that we don't need outside domesticators anymore. We are our own domesticators. And so we have this book of rules running through our heads, telling us how to behave. Don't take things personally comes up with, and I wanted to say one thing I've looked at, not just the things in this book, I've looked at blogs and teachers who are students of Don Miguel, and so they've added some ideas. So one of the things that I learned is that this one teacher says, if you can master, I don't know if ever master, these first two agreements, you've dealt with 75% of the teeny tiny irritations in your life. And he says, don't expect it to happen effectively in a week and a half of reading the book. It's a lifelong practice. And we might say this is too hard, but he says, that's really, he was very blatant and said, that's a lie. It's not too hard to change. Consider the options. If you don't change, isn't that a much harder way to live? To keep acting, to keep up the pretense, to make sure you're pleasing the people or the voices in your mind? So when we meditate, for example, we try to remember we're not that personality. We're a beloved part of all that is. We quiet those thoughts of shoulds and should nots, and we remember our true essence. So taking things personally, you know what? We take everything personally. We assume that we are the center of our world. We assume that people do things to us or say things to us because of us, and that people react to us. We aren't aware that they have their own beliefs and their own book of rules and their act that they must follow because they're entrenched in those beliefs. And so what we've done is we've automatically assumed that whatever people do around us or say to us is because of what they want to do to us. And really, they are just in their own world. So we've become masters at taking things personally. There's a couple phrases that I've seen on bumper stickers or think they ought to be there. Your opinion of me is none of my business. Wayne Dyer was the one who introduced that to me years ago. Your opinion of me is none of my business. And my mother helped me learn this one, although this is not her quote. We wouldn't worry so much about what other people think of us if we realize how seldom they do. This came, just a personal story about that. I was in a really confused time in my life and for not really clear about who I was. And I'm part of a large family, right smack in the middle of 5 children. And, the middle child syndrome is not really knowing who you are. You're just like, you're not the oldest, you're not the youngest. There was only one boy, so he got that identity, the only boy. I was just kind of shuffled around. And when I was in my anxious time 20 years ago, I remember talking on the phone and saying, I don't know what my siblings think of me. And I don't know why I was so bent out of shape about that. But my mom just said, Pat, they're not thinking about you. They've got their own lives. And sure, of course they did. We were all immersed in raising children 20 years ago, and little kids, and school, and PTA, and jobs, and paying the bills. They weren't spending any time thinking about me. But I was so immersed in figuring out who I was that I figured everybody must be noticing me. Isn't that something? Thanks, Mom, for that. That was very helpful to me. It stayed with me for a long, long time. So Don Miguel says these points about, and we'll keep this up for a while so it can sink in. Nothing others do is because of you. Wow. What others do is a projection of their own reality, their own dream, a projection. This is where we get into mirrors. When you are immune to the opinions and actions of others, you won't be a victim of needless suffering. Well, it's hard to do that, isn't it? Hard to be immune to the opinions of others. So what I wanted you to think about is knowing that opinion that comes to you unsolicited, of course. Someone says, "May I give you my advice?" You remember, it's coming from their eyes and their dream and their picture of reality, what should or shouldn't be. And you thank them because there is some truth in it, but it's not the whole truth. Of course not. And it's their truth. So filter it. If you can do that, you're somewhat immune, saying you don't have to rush around and say, "Oh, well, she thinks I ought to," and try to conform to that. See how you could be immune and not be a victim of needless suffering. So realize that when someone gives us that feedback, it's important to remember there's no true objective reality. We all have our biases and filters. Miguel tells us a story. I want you to play with this story, imagine it, that you're in a mall with a bunch of movie theaters, and you notice that the marquee has your name on one of those movie theaters. So you go into the theater to watch the movie, and it's empty except for one person. So you sit down behind that person really quietly so as not to disturb them. But she doesn't notice. She's got all of her attention on the movie. And so you watch the screen, and what a surprise. You're the star. And all the people in your life are characters in this movie. Your mother, your father, your children, your friends, your beloved. And you see that it's the story of you. And that person in front of you is you too. And it's watching you acting in that movie. And of course, the main character is just the way you believe you are. And so all the secondary characters in the movie are just what you expect them to be because it's the story of you. After a while, you feel a little overwhelmed, so you leave the movie theater and go to the next one. It's empty too, except for one person. And you decide to sit down right next to that person, a woman. Then you start to watch the movie and you recognize all the characters, but now you're just a secondary character. And that woman sitting next to you is your mother, and it's her movie. All the same faces are in it. Your siblings, your mother, your father, your elders. They're all in the movie. But they're all paying attention to your mother because she's the main character of the movie. And he goes on to explain this idea. Your mother's not the same person who was in the movie that you were just watching in the other theater. And she is the person who is acting the way she wants you to perceive her. She is projecting herself completely different in this movie than she did in your movie. She's just acting. That's what you realize. But you also notice that you yourself in her movie is not the person that you had going on in the other theater in your movie. Who you are in her movie is the person who she thinks you are. And then you realize that she is projecting who everybody is. You look at your father in your mother's movie, and you see him to be different than the way you saw him in your movie. He is the person who she thinks he is in her movie. And then you notice that your spouse or beloved is in your mother's movie. And that person is different than the way you saw your beloved in your movie. You see how that unfolds? Then he explains, you go to the third theater, and it's your beloved's movie. Spouse, ex-husband, wife, ex-wife, partner. And that movie is playing, and it's her or his movie. And you show up in that movie, of course, because you're a significant person in that person's life, but you hardly recognize yourself. It's not the way you perceive yourself, but it's the way your beloved perceives you. And you go to your children's movie, and you see how they perceive their parents and their grandparents. And it's different than the way you wanted to show up as a parent. And you find out everybody is distorting all the characters from your movie. So you go back to your first theater, and you watch your own movie again. And that's when Miguel says, you wake up. You look at yourself acting in your movie, and you no longer believe anything you're watching. You no longer believe your own story because you can see that it's just a story. Nobody perceives you the way you wanted to be perceived. You may have written the script, but they saw it from their lens. All the actors have their attention on their story, and that's what the true reality that they believe in. All the opinions that you have about the characters in your movie are not the same opinions that they have about the same characters in their movie, and so on and so forth. The only thing you know about the people that you know are what you believe about them. Wow. The only thing that I know about my children is what I believe about them. The only thing I know about my mother, and God knows how much work I've done to understand my relationship with her as you have with your whatever person is in your life. The only thing you know about that person is what you believe about them. Can you possibly step out of your movie and try to understand how their movie is playing out? That is the stretch that we're called to do, the unconditional love that we're called to have. And so Miguel continues. With this awareness, you realize how ridiculous it is to say, my beloved doesn't understand me. Nobody understands me. Well, of course they don't. You really don't even understand yourself because you're playing the act that you've been domesticated to play. You're always changing as you relate to different people. You'll relate differently to the people at work than you will be to your good friends who you have supper with once a month. Or you'll relate differently to your child than you would to your parent. And so we continue to put on these roles. And he concludes with this. Now, it's easy to understand why there's so much conflict among humans. Broaden that to cultural differences. Broaden that to racial differences. Broaden that to homophobic problems. It's easy to understand why there's so much conflict among humans. The world is populated by billions of dreamers who aren't aware that people are living in their own world, dreaming their own dream. From the point of view of the main character, which is their only point of view, everything is all about them. And when the secondary characters say something that doesn't agree with their story, they get angry and try to defend their point of view. And they want the secondary characters to be the way they want them to be. And if they are not, they feel hurt. Isn't that ridiculous? They take everything personally. With this awareness, you can understand the solution. It's so simple and logical. Don't take anything personally. Yeah. I've often had trouble understanding this teaching that everybody else is a mirror for me. And I'm starting to stretch into understanding that when I realize that I have created a movie with me as the main character. So when you show up in a way that offends me or hurts me, yeah, that's my mirror because I created you. I created who you are in my mind. So when you come in and say something that's offensive to me, it's my hurt that's getting touched, that festering wound that is getting touched. And I don't want you to touch it. So I get mad at you. I get defensive. But you haven't done anything because you're playing your movie. And you're treating me the way you see me to be. So there's the mirror idea. It's going to take a while to get that to sink in and realize the incredible, deep implications of it. Miguel Ruiz says that the work of understanding this is like the work of a spiritual warrior. Spiritual in the sense that it's not so much personality, but it's really digging deep into the real stuff of life. And warrior because it takes a lot of courage and discipline, which warriors need, to break out of the old habits and step into unknown. It's a war that we're waging against our programmed stories. He says, we are trying to challenge the old fears in our minds. So warrior is a really good term. He says a warrior is aware. Think about being aware of all the things around you, 360. That's what a warrior needs to do. And a warrior has courage to step into a place that could be riddled with danger. And a warrior has discipline to not swing or pull that trigger until it is absolutely the right thing to do. But the warrior also has commitment, and underlying commitment is love. And he mentions Jesus as the master spiritual warrior. And when I read this, I thought immediately of, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus spoke that when he was being killed by people who were playing out their movie. They were playing out their version of reality. and saw Jesus as an instigator who had to be quieted. So Jesus was working out his movie, his understanding of reality and what he needed to do, what he was called to do. And as they are torturing him, abusing him, and mocking him, he says, forgiveness, because they don't know what they're doing. He saw that they were playing out their movie. They had to do that because they had to stay with what they saw was right in their book of rules, in their dream. And they had to stop it, what he was breaking through, the truth he was breaking out into our consciousness. So he was able to say, with unconditional love, seeing that they were in their dream, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. That's a true spiritual warrior. There's another whole piece of this, and that's the words that come from our own mind. And they have opinions too. But that's an idea for another Sunday. So next week is the idea of don't make assumptions. I assumed that I knew all about that. And as I explore it this week and get ready to speak to you about it next week, I'm excited to see what kind of ahas I get. There's so much more to share than I can share in 20 minutes on Sunday morning. So I hope that I've engaged you enough to say, wow, maybe I can look at this conflict in my life a different way. Maybe I can look at this work-related situation in a new way and be the spiritual warrior that our master teacher has taught us. Can we forgive, knowing they don't know what they're doing? And so until then, namaste.